Good evening, everyone. Hello and welcome to Rocktown History's 2023 Third Thursday Talk Winter Webinar Series. I am Penny Imeson, Director for Rocktown History. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Tonight we return to the webinar-only format, which allows us to hear from voices further afield without concerns for inclement weather and travel restrictions. I'd like to introduce this evening's participants. You will meet two individuals with ties to Virginia's Department of Historic Resources. Randy Jones is nearly a lifelong resident of Harrisonburg, Rockingham County, and served as a public information officer with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources until his retirement last year. Previously, he served as a book editor at the Center for American Places, where he helped to bring to publication books that have won more than 100 Best Book Awards and honors in 31 academic fields. His expertise is welcome as a member of the Rocktown History Board of Trustees, and more recently as the editor of our recent publication of Silver Lake, 200 Years of a Shenandoah Valley Mill and Community, which is nearly sold out, but a reprint has been ordered. So if you haven't gotten your copy, stay tuned. As guest host this evening, Randy will introduce tonight's presenter, Kate Ridgway. We are recording the webinar tonight, and it will be made available on the Rocktown History YouTube channel. We'd love to hear from you this evening. After Kate speaks, Randy will enter into the conversation. I will be monitoring the chat, but ask that you use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. The presenters and I will see your comments and questions, but they will remain anonymous to the general audience. So, for those of you just joining us, welcome. I am pleased to start our conversation on what conservation can do for you by handing the mic to guest host Randy Jones.
Thank you so much, Penny. I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. One of the most interesting roles at DHR I always thought was the position of conservator, and we're going to learn something about that tonight. I always loved visiting Kate in her lab, and you can see her in her lab tonight down in Richmond. Kate has been with DHR going on 10 years this month, so she's been there a while. She previously worked as a assistant conservator at the renowned Field Museum in Chicago, Field Natural History Museum in Chicago. She also worked as a conservator at Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon. And she's a native of Virginia, so I'm glad she's back in the state and with DHR. She's a wonderful speaker and a wonderful person to know. I won't say much more other than to say I'm looking forward to this presentation, Kate, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Kate Ridgway, the State Archaeological Conservator. I am going to talk to you today about what I do in conservation. I find that there are usually several people who have never heard of conservation and maybe don't know conservators, but most folks involved with historical societies and history museums have artifacts, they have personal belongings, they are involved with cemeteries and buildings, and they want them to be preserved. So I'm here tonight to explain what conservation is, what conservators do, and how I, as a state resource, can help you with conservation questions that you might have. So when I'm talking to a new group, I like to talk a little bit about my background, because if you've never met me, you have no reason to believe what I'm saying. So let's talk a little bit about where I'm from. So originally I'm from Hampton, Virginia, and I started out my career at William and Mary. I got my undergraduate there in anthropology and classical studies. I was most of my way through a degree in focusing on archaeology when I realized that I did not want to be an archaeologist. And so I took a quick turn and started my career as an archaeological conservator, where I got to work with the artifacts in a nice air-conditioned lab, not out in the dirt with the bugs and the heat and the humidity, which I found that I preferred. So I started my career in conservation working with Emily Williams at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. I decided it really was for me. So I just went to grad school at the University of Durham in Northern England. It's near Newcastle for people who know England. While I was there, I had to do an internship. So I interned for a year at the National Museums of Scotland in Edinburgh, which if you're ever over there, I highly recommend going to visit. Then I got my first sort of real job at the Field Museum in Chicago. I was the loans conservator, so I worked with other institutions that wanted to borrow our artifacts, and I would escort the artifacts around the world. And then I had to come back to Virginia for personal reasons, and so I got a job as the decorative arts conservator at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And as lovely as Mount Vernon is, it is all George Washington all the time. And I wanted a little more variety, and my dream job opened up at DHR. So I finally got the job I wanted, and now I've been here for 10 years. Besides that, I teach Intro to Conservation at University of Mary Washington. I'm also a member of the Virginia Conservation Association and a fellow in the American Institute for Conservation. So I've been doing conservation in one form or another for about 25 years now. So hopefully that gives you some confidence that I know what I'm talking about. So what is conservation? So people who have heard of conservation, they frequently know that conservators, we put things back together. So we'll put a vase back together, we'll make things look good for exhibits, we do this kind of thing. But conservation has like a bigger role to play than that. And so really the goal of conservation is to preserve our cultural heritage for future generations. And there's an expectation that artifacts, they have a lifespan like we do. And conservation is about making that lifespan of that artifact as long as possible so it can continue to serve future generations in a way that can be educational or research or whatever the artifact needs to do. So that's our goal as conservators. Let's make artifacts last as long as possible and help with research, help with education. So one thing I want to get clear from the beginning is that we frequently are called conservationists on accident. We are not conservationists, we're conservators. Conservationists, they love spotted owls and whales and trees, and that's not to say conservators don't, but we're conservators. So if you really want to impress a conservator, make sure you call them by the right title. So what do? Our goal is to minimize the effects of deterioration in conservation. So there are all sorts of things that might cause your artifact to start to degrade. And so we are trying to make that process slower. And we're also trying to balance this need for people to be able to access artifacts with the long-term requirements for preservation. The whole point of an artifact is to have a life outside of storage. And so we need to balance that damage that is caused by it being put on display or being used for research with the idea that it needs to have that or else it doesn't have a point. And so we're trying to safeguard all of the characteristics of an object and the structures about them that make them informative and awe-inspiring and enjoyable and beautiful and whatever it is about that object that makes it significant. So how do we do this? Conservation, it's two main activities. It's rectifying the effects of existing or past deterioration and preventing future deterioration. So our first goal, it's just like your doctor. Your doctor says, eat your vegetables, get some exercise so that you don't end up in surgery. So that's prevention. That's what we're trying to do. We want people to pay attention to artifacts, treat them well, treat houses well, make sure that you're doing the care that you need to do so that we don't end up having to do a major expensive treatment on the artifact. We also do a lot of documentation. We don't know what's going to happen when we're treating these artifacts. We hope that we're going to improve them, but there's always a chance something happens in our lab. And so we want to document the artifact before we even do anything to it, because we might not know what we're getting into. So we also do a lot of object identification. We have these we have all this understanding and knowledge about how artifacts are made and what they're made out of and what people used to do with them. And so we use that knowledge to help people understand what the object is at all. We also do a lot of analysis. We have to understand a lot of scientific techniques to understand how to use things like X-ray machines or portable X-ray fluorescent machines or any of these other things you might have heard of on CSI. We do a lot of that kind of analysis to help us understand these artifacts, maybe to help researchers understand what they're made out of and things like that. Along with this comes a lot of decision making. Is what we're doing going to make it better? Is it going to make it worse? Is it not going to have the expected outcome? We know a lot about like adhesives and like what kind of adhesive we're going to use, this kind of thing. So before we do anything, we also make a treatment proposal. We talk about what we want to do with the people who own the artifact. So in my case, I talk to the people here who are archaeologists, and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and these are the results. And is that okay with whatever your research plan is for this object? Once we get the okay, and we've discussed what's going to happen to the object, I do the treatment, and then I do more documentation. I take a picture afterwards and document the difference between what it looks like, what it looks like now. And so then in the future, if it looks different again, somebody will be able to tell. And then we have to do all of this as part of a team. Conservators don't work alone. They have to be part of a team where they can ask questions about the goals of the object. We work with other conservators because there might be some part of the process we're not experts in. So we have this whole group of people that we're working with when we're doing our jobs. So why do we go through all of this? So conservation is expensive, it's time consuming. Why do we put any effort into this? And usually it's because the object is prized for one reason or another. I would love to say all objects are created equal. That's sort of how we were taught 20 years ago or whenever I went to grad school. But in the reality is, especially in archaeological conservation, we're not going to treat every brick that comes out of an archaeological site. If we know there's a brick house there, we have lots of bricks. We don't need to treat every brick. We don't need to treat every nail. We know what nails are like. We know what they look like. There's no diagnostic value there. So we might not treat every nail. So what we're doing is trying to figure out with the resources we have, where is that best spent? What are we really trying to do? So is this artifact going to go on display? Is this artifact going to be part of some kind of research? Those are the ones that we might actually spend time on and work with, because we know there's an end goal there that is worth the effort that we're going to have to put in. So I said we facilitate access to cultural heritage. And so the idea is that first, we're making these artifacts stable enough so that people can understand them, researchers can understand them, they can be put on display for education. But that's also a visual thing. So if I have all these pieces of a jar, a researcher might be like, oh, I know that stoneware jar. I don't need to look at it anymore. I'm fine, and you can leave it in pieces. But if I put that on exhibit, the people coming to the exhibit aren't going to know what's going on. So what we do is we put it together so that it actually can tell the story it needs to tell. Archaeologically, we have these artifacts, and you can see over on here on the right, you can see this artifact, and it's coming out of the ground, and it does not look like anything in particular. And an archaeologist gets really excited because they're like, oh my gosh, it's jack of plate. It's an early kind of armor. This is amazing. This is so cool. But you put that in an exhibit and they're going to be like, well, that looks like mud. So what we do, this took 5 years. So you can see the picture below is after it was treated. So the Melba Myers, who was my predecessor, removed all the mud. She removed all the rust. She had a mount made, and so now we can put this on exhibit. You can actually see this artifact at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And while not everyone may know what a jack of plate is, it's all these little plates that they would have sewn into a quilted material, and you would wear it like a shirt. That's where the curators come in and they can explain it. But now at least people can see it. So sometimes people get confused between conservation and restoration. This is sort of a continuum. Conservators do restoration and restorers do some conservation. Conservation is focused on changing that object as little as possible, preserving all of the history. We might fix a chair, but you can't use that chair ever again. It's not strong enough to hold your weight. Whereas a restorer is going to look at that chair and say, okay, it needs to function again. It needs to be aesthetically pleasing again. We need this chair to serve a purpose. And so they're going to focus more on making sure that chair is something that can be useful again. So they may replace all the legs and replace the textile on the seat and do these different things that a conservator would not necessarily do, because for us it's a historic document. So that's not saying restorers are bad people. They just do a different service than conservators do, and we're all sort of on this continuum. So let's talk a little bit about the basics of conservation. So first, we do no harm. I'm going to talk about each of these individually, but we do no harm. We want to make sure our stuff, that anything that we're doing is reversible or retreatable. We try to do minimal intervention, and we always do documentation. So let's talk a little about what that means. So do no harm, pretty self-explanatory. We're trying to make sure that we're doing the best thing for that artifact within the limits of our resources. So not every lab is the Smithsonian or the Getty or the Met. Like all the labs are not created equal. But for me and my lab and my resources, what's the best I can do for this artifact? And if it's truly I can't accomplish it here, I won't treat the artifact. I'll find a better lab for it. And so my specialty is archaeological conservation, and I'm not going to try and step outside of that specialty. And so if there's something that's coming in, like a painting, I would not treat it. I would advise somebody to get a paintings conservator. So here, this is just a really good example from a while ago in Spain. A fresco was conserved in a way that was beyond the skills of the person who was doing it. So it just gives you a sense of like why we're trying to make sure that we're doing the best for the artifact. We also want to make sure that the next people can actually retreat something. We love to think that we're so smart and that we're not going to make any mistakes and that we're using the best materials, but let's be realistic. It's 2023, and 100 years from now, there could be all these new amazing technologies and materials and stuff. And so we are going to recognize the fact that we are just the current caretakers, and that the future there may be something better. So say this lion, it has this lovely copper corrosion on it, but it's not really what the city is going for. So they remove that copper corrosion. Well, we can't reverse that, but we can make sure that lion is retreatable. So we put a patina on it, we put some wax on it, we make sure that this lion, we can take that coating off and recoat it so that this lion can be retreated in the future and not end up covered in corrosion again. There's a picture of King Tut's mask in the middle there because it's a pretty famous story if you Google it. A conservator took there were people working around the mask, and the beard broke off, and the conservator reattached it using epoxy. Now, I'm not going to trash talk this conservator. I'm sure it was a very stressful situation. I'm sure they had very important people breathing down their neck, and they really needed to get this back together. But ideally, epoxy is not what we would have used. It's not reversible. Epoxy is permanent. And so eventually it did get retreated. They used a more appropriate beeswax to glue it back on, and it did harm the object a little bit to take that epoxy off, and so it was not the best choice. But that's the idea, is that we don't want to do things that are so permanent that it can't be redone again. So we also practice minimum intervention. This means that what we're hoping to do is as little as possible to make the artifact do whatever the artifact needs to do. So in this case, it's a tombstone. We need it to be legible. We need people to be able to read it. It might be that it needs to look beautiful because there's an event. Like, these are the kinds of things. And we might have to reset it because it's unsafe. So we're going to do the minimum amount of work to accomplish the task at hand, because the more work we do, the more likely we are to change the artifact, affect the history of the artifact, damage the artifacts, and we don't want any of that to happen. So if it's just going into storage, we might not do anything at all. If it's going to be for a researcher, we would probably do something like put it together, but we're not going to go out of our way to make it look pretty or whole or anything like that, because the researcher doesn't need that. But if it's going on display, we might do a lot more. And then there's documentation, arguably the most important part of this. So documentation is so important because, like I said before, we need to make sure that we're showing the past what we've done. So in this case, somebody had to repaint the eye and they had to take off an old varnish that changed the colors. And so we want to document that so that the future knows what we've done. We also have another rule that's called the 6-inch, 6-foot rule, which I know is it sounds a little odd. So the idea here is that when we fix an artifact and we put it on display, people love to focus on what's wrong with the artifact. Like it's just in human nature to figure out like, oh, that statue's missing arms and that statue's the wrong color or whatever. Like things are wrong. It's easy to pick that out. And so as conservators, our goal is to try and make it so that whatever's wrong with it is at least not the first thing you notice. So hopefully the first thing you notice is the artifact and what it does and what it looks like. So this artifact is a Greek cup called a kylix, and it's a really good example of this because the person who mended this, they actually didn't add any of the decorations back that might have been there. They left all of those blank, but they did such a good job in painting and filling it in the right colors that it's not the first thing you notice is all the little bits that are missing. You notice that there's 3 people, somebody has a sword and a bow, and there's a whole scene going on. So hopefully that's the first thing you notice. We don't want to trick people. We don't want this to end up in an art market where people think we've made something that has never been broken. We want artifacts to be what they are. So we won't cover up real paint. We won't cover up real parts of the object. We try to avoid all of that. So the idea is that an expert can look at this from 6 inches and be like, oh, this is what they did. This is that, the other thing. So hopefully that's the kind of job that we're doing. So like I said, there's a lot of different conservation specializations. So I am an objects conservator who specializes in archaeological materials. There are people who specialize in decorative arts. There's people who specialize in ethnographic materials, but there's also people who specialize in furniture, people who specialize in books and paper, excuse me, people who specialize in textiles, paintings, conservation science. Honestly, if there's a type of object, there's somebody who specializes in it. There are people who just do glass. There's people who just do metals. Colonial Williamsburg used to have a conservator who just did scientific and musical instruments. That's all he did. He would have an organ disassembled in his lab. So it really just depends. So my specialty is archaeological objects, and especially archaeological objects from colonial sites and Virginia sites. So having said all this, what does it take to be a conservator? Well, it's a weird job to get. So before you even get into grad school, you have to prove that you can have depth perception. So you can't only have one eye. You have to prove you can see all of the color spectrum, because if you're colorblind, you can't match colors successfully. You have to have at least 4 semesters of chemistry so that you know how to work in a lab and you know how the chemicals work. You have to show that you have a lot of dexterity. So you have to show that you can do art. You have to show that you have some ability with your hands so that you're not going to be dropping objects all the time and making things worse. So it's very hard to get into school. It can take 3 years, 3 tries to get into grad school. I can count the number of grad schools in the United States on one hand, and they usually take about 8 to 12 students a year. And so there's only a few thousand conservators in the entire country. If you limit that to archaeological conservators, it's probably 100, a few hundred, maybe. Just to give you a sense of like how odd a job it is. So another important thing for conservators is that understanding of cultural heritage. It spans all of human history. It spans all cultures. It spans all countries, everything that humans have done, and paleontology too. So really it's whatever ends up in museums, that's where conservators are. And part of a conservator's job is to make sure that people feel comfortable coming to them with their cultural heritage. So I work for the people for the Commonwealth of Virginia, and all the people who live here should feel comfortable trusting me to do my best for their cultural heritage. That's our goal, is that you should feel okay asking conservators for help. So history really, especially recently, can feel very divisive, but it is 100% not my job to judge history. It's to work with the community, help them decide what to preserve. It's to advise them on their path towards preserving what they think is important for their history. As some of you know, I led a large team of people opening the boxes that were found under the Lee statue on Monument Avenue here in Richmond. And I also played a small part in reviewing the proposal to remove the monument. And I worked with a lot of people who had their heritage damaged during the riots that happened in Richmond. And so my job is to go where the history is. It's not to decide what the history is. And so I'm not going to dwell on this. I've done a lot of talks about this, and I'm sure you can find some on YouTube, but this is just to give you an idea of my role and conservation's role as sort of an advisor for communities. So this is an amazing Ronald Reagan quote, and it's kind of true. He gave this quote during a news conference in 1986, and state government can seem like this large faceless machine. I just want you to know that I'm a firm believer in the idea that if you are living in Virginia, you're paying your taxes, then you own a certain amount of my time. You should get something from the government that you pay for. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things that I might be able to help you with, just to give you a sense of like the reasons that you might want to call me. Okay, number one question out of the gate that I get from the public: how do I preserve this cemetery? How do I preserve this gravestone? And all the time we get this question, so much that I sometimes just like copy and paste the same email, because I'm like, this is all the same, very same question. We're trying to actually get our website up and running in a way that we can have a lot of the sort of like questions that are frequently asked on our website so that y'all can have that information right away. And so we actually, as DHR, we actually send professionals out to communities and do cemetery workshops. You can actually see one we did here in 2014 at Woodbine. We were there for Woodbine and Newtown cemeteries. Some of you may have been at that workshop. And so we come and we try and talk to communities about preserving your cemeteries, how to read the different symbols, what are the laws that are attached to cemeteries and human remains. And so we try and do that and get this information out to you. That being said, we're not mind readers. So if you need our help, then you reach out and we will figure out a way to get a cemetery workshop to you. When I first joined here, before I first joined DHR, I was actually walked into my lab and there were half a dozen skeletons in the lab from a cemetery, from Tangier Island in the Chesapeake Bay. And so that island has been eroding for a long time. And Hurricane Sandy came and absolutely just eroded this cemetery called Uppards in the northern side of Tangier. And all of these human remains were going into the ocean, and the gravestones were being washed all over the place. And so in this picture, you can actually see me trying to remove salts from human remains from the bones, because if we left the salty water in those bones and just let them dry, all that salt turns into crystals and it basically explodes your bone because the salt crystals get so large. And so we have to get those salt crystals out before we can dry them. So this is all part of the job. I also do a lot of I get a lot of public inquiries. I get a lot of people asking me for advice on the care of artifacts. So this is my email and my phone number. You're more than welcome to contact me anytime. I do try and answer questions as quickly as possible, but hopefully you understand I'm the only conservator here. And so if it takes me a little while, please don't judge me. And if you, please feel free to bug me more than once if you sent me something and I haven't managed to get back to you. That being said, I don't know everything. And what I always say is, if you are working with a conservator and they say they know everything, you should run away. You should run very fast and very far, because no conservator knows it all. And so when you ask me a question and it's not about archaeology, I can find somebody who can help you. And so what we can do is work with you to find someone through the American Institute for Conservation. They actually have ways you can find somebody yourself if you feel more comfortable doing that. You can go on their website, you can call this number, you can email that email address. And everyone that the American Institute for Conservation recommends will be somebody who has been vetted, who has turned in a portfolio, shown that they have a caliber of skills that is something that they can tell the public about. And so it's just a form you fill out. You say where you are, you check some boxes to say what is your object, what is it made out of, and then they pop out a bunch of names for you and contact information. Like I said, conservators are pretty rare, so the conservators may not be near you, but conservators who work in private practice are frequently willing to travel. We also have the Virginia Conservation Association, and so you can email them as well. And they also have a website that has a Find a Conservator program on it. And so those are going to be people who are more likely to be in Virginia, although they do have people who joined when they were in Virginia have moved out, but the names on there should be pretty relevant and recent. Another thing I do all the time is I find other people at DHR who can help. So I find that sometimes I'm the only person people have met, or I'm one of the people that they're most familiar with, because I do try and get out there and I do work with a lot of communities. And then I get emails about things that are really just not at all what I do. And so people like Joanna Wilson Green, who you can see here, she's our fairly new cemetery preservation expert. She's the one who deals with all the human remains issues. She deals with all the cemetery issues. If there's a particular preservation issue, she brings me in, but she's the main go-to for cemeteries. You also have regional archaeologists. So your regional archaeologist is Bob Jolly. Maybe some of you have worked with him. And so you can call them as well. And if you don't know who it is or who to get in touch with, you can always get in touch with me and I can get you their contact information. We also now have an underwater archaeologist, Brendan Burke. And then we also do easements and tax credits. We do historic markers. We do all sorts of things at the Department of Historic Resources that I think not a lot of people are aware of. And so the goal is that even if I'm the only person you know, I will try and get you to the right person at DHR because we are genuinely trying to help you and help preserve history. Another thing I find that I'm helping a lot of people with are grants. If you're a part of a small institution, you probably don't have a lot of funding. You probably don't have a lot of staff. And so it's hard to find grants. It's hard to write grants. It's hard to know what to apply for. So that's another way that I can help you. I can help you try and figure out places where you can fund the conservation of an artifact, or my favorite one is this collections assessment program, the CAP program. And it's amazing for getting a basic understanding of what's going on with your collections. And then they create a great record of the conservation needs you have, the preservation needs you have. And then you can use it as that document as a jumping off point to apply for more grants. And so we know all sorts of ways to get money. And even in state government, we have cemetery preservation grants. We just announced a new BIPOC historic preservation grant. And so there are some that are just money from the state government that is funneled through our agency so that we can get it out to the public. I also, and this is rare, I don't always do this, but I do a limited amount of contract work. And I do the contract work usually for smaller institutions. We just understand that labs are expensive, conservators are rare, and there are going to be a few things here and there that a small institution might need some help with for conservation. What I will say is that I don't do it often. I have to get my boss's approval because I have obviously 10,000 other things I'm probably trying to do, but we do a pro bono as long as it's not on any deadline, because I have to fit in these projects here and there when I can. And sometimes we have interns working on them, people who are trying to get into conservation. And so here you see the Fairfield plantation stove. It's actually the door from a stove. You see the stove and then the x-ray we did. And so I have the whole stove in the lab right now. It was nominated for one of Virginia Association of Museums' top 10 most endangered artifacts. And it didn't win, and I was keeping track of that project or that process that year, and I thought that this object was really important. It's from an early freed Black woman's dwelling on Fairfield Plantation. She ended up staying there, and it's actually probably the building it was in was burned down, and it's probably the reason the building burnt down. And so it just comes from a really interesting context, and I reached out to them and I said I would help them. And so I have a few things in the lab that I'm actually working on for institutions. I will say I don't do work for individuals, but I'm happy to find people who will. We also do emergency response. So small institutions, if they catch on fire or there's a hurricane or a flood, it can be really hard to recover. It can be hard to have enough hands and expertise to deal with something that can be a tragedy for a community. And it may be something like a hurricane where everybody's affected, and so everybody's dealing with their own responsibilities. And so this is a way that we might be able to help you if it's expertise or people to come out that depending on the disaster, we might be able to help you. We also would love for you to have a disaster plan so we could help you get resources to write one of those as well. And health and safety issues. This is one of my favorites. I think people don't understand how dangerous artifacts can be. So there are things like orange Fiesta ware, that lovely red orange Fiesta ware is actually radioactive because they use uranium in it. And the Vaseline glass that looks so cool under black light and glows like a highlighter, also made with uranium. Is it dangerous? It sounds like it would be because it's uranium. And it can be if you ate off that plate. Yeah, you would probably be eating radioactive material and that would not be good. But just to look at, no, it's not a problem. And so helping people understand the health and safety issues of their artifacts is really important. There was a lot of heavy metals used in the past. And on the left here, you can see this is a Revolutionary War grenade being destroyed by the bomb squad. Actually, in 2018, you can find an article in the Virginia Pilot that's really well done. We found 25 Revolutionary War hand grenades in the lab, and for the most part, the grenades weren't really intact. It was the gunpowder was there though. And so as a matter of safety, because we're in a public building, and we worked with archaeologists, we made sure there was no research value there. We had them safely removed. We worked with the bomb squad and had them destroyed because it was safer to do that than keep them. And we did all the documentation. We did everything we could. And so if you'd like to know more about that story, it's amazing. It's from, all those grenades were from a Revolutionary War ship called Betsy that was sank on purpose in the York River during the Battle of Yorktown. So that's another sort of fascinating story. And finally, I do a lot of talking to young folks and people who have decided to switch careers about how you become a conservator. And so part of that process is also getting experience in a lab. And so that's my goal too, is to help people who are aspiring conservators, understand the reality of being a conservator. It's not easy. It's not easy to get into grad school. It's not easy to get a job. You don't get paid a lot. But also to help them get the hours they need, because it's really hard to find labs that will support interns. And so that's one of the nice things I can do at my lab is I can support about one intern at a time to help them get hours so they can start to apply for graduate school. I thought I'd wrap up today's talk with a little bit of a discussion of a conservation project that is pretty recent and in Harrisonburg, and you might be driving by it all the time. So you're probably familiar with the Lady Liberty World War I Memorial. It's in the city of Harrisonburg. It's about to have its 100th anniversary next year. And it was the center of a celebration of the 100th anniversary of the by the American Legion of the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day. And if you know Andy Banks, the Harrisonburg city manager, and Ben Ritter, who's he's a member of the American Legion Post 27, they approached me about what it might take to preserve this artifact. And a lot of communities have these sculptures and things that are in the public eye, and they want to do their best for them, and they are making suggestions, and it's a big responsibility. And so that's one of the things I love to do, is help people figure out the best way to do that. And so luckily I was able to help connect Andy and Ben with a colleague of mine, Howard Wellman, who works in private practice. He works on memorials and cemeteries, and he's excellent. And he actually came and did work on this memorial so that it could be celebrated during its 100th anniversary and sort of rededicated, and have just another chance at another 100 years. As you can imagine, being outside, being in the elements, being in Harrisonburg, I'm sure there's a lot of snow and rain and freezing weather. And so all of that after 100 years is going to take its toll. And so hopefully this will be a monument that y'all can be proud of for a really long time. While this project was going on, though, there was sort of an interesting discovery. As a part of this monument, there is this scroll with the names of the people who died protecting our country during World War I from the community, from the county. And when you look, when you're walking by, you might not notice this. You may have looked at this 100 times. But when you get close to it, you can see that there are 6 names at the end of the scroll that are separated by a little decorative element. And it turns out that those are the Black soldiers who were working, who were helping defend the US during World War I. And so on this monument from 100 years ago, those names were separated out. And so there was some concern in the community that this is something that needed to be undone, and that those names needed to be reincorporated into the list. Now, as a conservator, that is not my favorite idea. I like the history of artifacts to stay the way they are. It tells you something about what life was like in Harrisonburg 100 years ago. History is what it is. And the other thing is, this is a bronze statue, and frustratingly not a Word document where it would be easy to sort of reintegrate these names. And so I told Andy that we have a person here who's our community outreach coordinator, Tim Roberts, who helps communities understand their history and works with them to figure out the best way to go forward when there are sort of difficult topics with their past. And what Tim pointed out is that this is what it is. It's the history, and that reintegrating these names is not necessarily in the best interest of history. It makes these people harder to do research on because they'll be put in with everybody else. It makes them less noticeable. It's not necessarily the right move for understanding the history of this monument. And so there were many discussions about having a bigger conversation in the community to recognize that this is what this is. We're not going to change the monument because the monument is a historic document, and that there might be a better way to address this, recognize it, talk about it, and figure out a better way for the community to have an understanding of what's going on with this monument. It doesn't have to mean that your monument changes. And it's good to understand all of that sort of community history. And so I think the hope is, and I don't know if Andy's listening, but the hope is that there might be a plinth or something added to the side of the road so that people can sort of understand that decision-making process and why the names are this way. And so that's kind of just an interesting project that I've been working on with Andy and Ben for, gosh, I think it's probably been a year now that we've been working on this project. Mostly I was an advisor. Howard Wellman did all the hard work. Andy Banks, Ben, they did all the hard work. So I just thought I'd end with that, talk a little bit about some conservation that happened in your own county. So all that being said, I thought I'd leave some time so that y'all could ask me some questions. So what I'm going to try and do, I'm going to try and stop sharing my screen. Let's see if I can. Oh, I have stopped sharing my screen. And here we are. Back. I cannot see Penny. I can't see anybody else. Did no one come? Did I just do that for myself?
Oh, we have people on. We have at least
Okay.
we have at least one question for you.
Oh, sure.
Let me check it out here.
Okay. Excellent.
Here's the question. Near my home on the edge of Harrisonburg is a circa 1785 claims cabin, which was the means by which European settlers obtained land claims for acreage taken from indigenous groups. It's deteriorating badly after 20 past years with an uninvolved owner. Who can help preserve it?
That is a good question. So I mentioned that every region of Virginia has an archaeologist, but you also have an architectural historian who helps working with those kinds of projects. I think, is it Audra? I'm trying to remember who your architectural historian is.
Aubrey
Aubrey
Van Lindern.
Yeah, Aubrey Van Lindern is the person who helps with that. And so I would start by reaching out to her, and then she can help figure out the best way to try and see if there's a way to engage the property owner, or if there's some other way we can do something to help preserve that property. It just sort of depends. And that's, again, one of those things where it's out of my sort of bailiwick, but I would start there. And you can find all of our phone numbers on our website. And it doesn't have our emails. There's some IT reason we don't have our emails on there, but you can use the same as mine. It's your first name and last name with the dhr.virginia.gov. All of that's the same, and you can email if you prefer emailing. So I would call her and I would start there. And if that ends up not being a good option, then let me know. Or she'll send you to the right person. Yeah.
I will just add, she's based out of Stevens City in northern Shenandoah Valley. So
yep,
she's the regional person.
Yeah, our regional people are actually in the regions. So hopefully you can actually, they can be there relatively reasonably, in a reasonable way. We're not all in Richmond.
We just have somebody saying hello, and they've enjoyed it. Professor Sarah Brooks, who's with JMU and the Northeast Neighborhood Association. Northeast Neighborhood, for your information, Kate, is the historically Black part of Harrisonburg.
Awesome.
And Sarah Brooks says she's a wonderful talk in conservation of the Firemen's Medal.
Oh, the Firemen's Medal, right. So there was hopefully they've gotten it back. The Firemen's Medal. So there was a Firemen's Medal found in one of the Black communities. I think it wasn't too far. It was Dallard Newman House, if people know where that is.
Yes, and that's the base for Nina.
Perfect. And so that was really cool. It came here and it was just covered in green corrosion. I wish I had pictures. It was just covered in this green corrosion, and it was a fireman's medal from a fireman's conference where they would get together. And when I was done, we realized it was covered in gilding and it was just beautiful. And so that was one of the little contract conservation projects that I did, because that was really cool. Yeah, I was glad to work on that artifact. So if you get a chance to see it, you should see it.
What is a fireman's medal?
So it's this little actually you can go. I wish I had a picture, but it's like a little like medal that you wear. So it has like a little pin in it, and it would be given out to firemen when they were at various conferences and things when they were meeting up. And so this one dated to the early I want to say this one was early 1900s. I sort of treat artifacts and I know a lot about them while I'm treating them, and then I have to free up that brain space for the next thing. So it's from around the 1920s, I want to say. And the interesting thing about it too was that we revealed on the back that it was made by this manufacturer, and the manufacturer still exists. And so I sent them back with the contact information for that manufacturer, because I thought they might be able to reach out and say, hey, what's the history here? Because you guys used to make these medals and you're still around. So I thought that was cool. So yeah, so it's a little copper badge that looks like a fireman's badge almost, and you would just wear it at these conferences. So yeah.
Here's another question. One of the points you make is about the changing treatment and technology and methods. What do you have some examples in DHR's collections of things that were, I don't want to say incorrectly treated, but they used the methods at the time, and in retrospect, those methods were not the most effective?
Yep, and any collection that's been around a while is going to have that. And so we have waterlogged wood that came from that shipwreck I was telling you about, the Betsy. And so it's from the Revolutionary War, and they tried 3 different methods of treatment on it. 2 we don't use anymore, and 1 we still use. So one they treated with this method called acetone rosin, where they were actually using sort of pine sap to rehydrate the wood and let it keep its structure. Because if you have wet wood and you've ever let it dry, you know it sort of shrinks and deforms. And so you try not to let that happen in conservation. And so they tried that, and it kind of worked, but you can't undo it. And it changed the color of things, and it wasn't that great. And then they tried something called the sucrose method, the sugar method, where they impregnated the entire piece of wood with sugar. And so when we're working on those artifacts now, it kind of smells like an IHOP. And it's awesome, except for it makes me want pancakes. And the problem with that is that if you've ever had sugar in anything like humidity, I don't know, like Virginia, you know it gets sticky. And so when we try and put those artifacts out, they're sticky all the time, and sugar crystals come to the surface, and it's just not that great. And so we don't use that one anymore either. It's very cheap, but it's not great. So now we use something that's called polyethylene glycol. That's a water soluble wax, and it's actually in like hair conditioner, and I think in some food things to make it sort of smooth. And we use it in conservation to make sure wood doesn't shrink and it stays the same color and can be put on display. And it's yeah, so technology changes all the time. We try not to get stuck in our ways. It's hard as people, but yeah, so we have lots of examples of, we don't use Elmer's glue much anymore. We don't use electrolysis to strip iron anymore. We don't do that. So there's a lot of different things that we just have better ways now. And that's why you go get your master's degree and keep up with your professional development. Yep.
What's some of the technology that's helped the most recently with conservation?
The technology that helps me the most is X-rays, which is not that recent. But I use a lot of what's called a X-ray fluorescence, which is a machine that we use to tell us what the surface of an object is made out of. And so it'll tell us that an object is made out of copper and zinc. And so we know that that object is brass now. Or maybe it'll tell us that there's some weird mineral in there that we might be able to match up with a source. So we can say, oh, this artifact was made from clay over there. And so we have that kind of technology, which can be really helpful. We use all sorts of things. And so we're like a medium-sized lab. So we have some kind of fun tools. But if you go to the real big labs, they have really fancy stuff that's just kind of awesome. And they're doing all sorts of 3D. And so we like to partner with these other labs when we can, but probably portable XRF, it's probably a $40,000 machine that we use. So yeah, that's probably the fanciest thing I got.
Do you share equipment with other labs?
The X-ray machine we can't move because it's lead lined for safety. The portable XRF we can take wherever we want. So we've definitely taken that out in the field to archaeological sites. Yeah, we've definitely taken that around to help people. Otherwise the microscopes and things we use are just not that portable. So we like to have people come to us if they have a really specific question. But otherwise I will go to, if people have things that they think might explode though, we don't want you bringing those here. I will come to you and have a look, or I will, if you're in the Richmond area, have the bomb squad come to you and have a look. And the bomb squad is really great. They are not going to steal your artifact and go blow it up. They are willing to have conversations. But honestly, it can be very dangerous to have things from various wars. Virginia's had a lot of things that explode in it, so we get people digging up their garden in Richmond and finding Civil War ordnance, and it's not good. So
Any other questions, folks who are here? Send them along. We got a little bit more time.
let's see. I
While
see. Okay.
while we're waiting, in case anybody does have another question, you might want to explain that skeleton over your for us over your left shoulder.
Dave is our mascot for the lab. He is not a real skeleton. He is made out of plastic. And so a lot of what we have to do with identification, sometimes we have to identify human remains. And thankfully, I don't have to do that as much anymore. Joanna Wilson Green and my newer boss, the state archaeologist, is a bone expert. And so, but he's still around. It's still nice. It's still nice to use to explain to people where parts of the body are. And when we're working with archaeological materials, we're almost never finding the whole thing. So we're not finding a whole piece of skull. We're not finding a whole artifact. We're finding like a little piece of a knife or something. And so half of my job is trying to figure out like pattern recognition. What part of a larger object is this? What part of an animal or a human is this? Because it's not as easy as all that. Or I x-ray it and now I can see it and now I got to figure out what's going on. So yeah, so that's a lot of my job. So we have a lot of like example things in around the lab where we can compare things because we got to figure out where it came from.
Any good recommendations for movies that involve conservators?
Well, does the conservation have to be good conservation or just has to have a conservator in it?
Conservatory in it.
Then I would say Ghostbusters 2.
Okay.
Ghostbusters 2 has that's the first one that comes to mind, but I also like bad movies, so you know, it might not be for you.
All right. Thanks so much, Kate. What a great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you.
This has been really fun. And I would think that anybody talking to you about your job would want to run and try to figure out how to become a conservator. So maybe there will be more people in the schools or applying.
You know what? They can try. It's hard to get in.
Well, for an odd job, you make it sound really great. So it's super fun. I'm just intrigued by all of those opportunities behind the scenes. And I know that for Rocktown history, there are some items in our collection that I would like to get some advice on. So maybe we will be in touch in the future.
Yep, I can come and visit anytime. Not a problem.
Well, again, thank you for that fascinating insight. And it's nice to know what's going on in preservation around the state, I guess, as a taxpayer, but also
hopefully state government's a little less scary now and you feel like you can reach out.
Absolutely. I took notes.
Okay, good.
So thank you for sharing your expertise and enthusiasm. And thank you, Randy, also. I'm just going to quickly share my screen and do those little housekeeping notes that it's part of my job. So
I will sign off then. So you guys have fun, have a good night. And yeah, let me know if you need me back to give a lecture about, you know, bombs or something.
Okay. Well, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Kate.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that didn't work. Let's try again. All right, so you probably saw in the beginning, I'm a little rusty with my Zoom skills. So I apologize if I was a distraction in the beginning. But I do want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. It was great to hear from Kate, and I'm so pleased that we could get our series going again for 2023. Let's see. I'm sorry, there we go. Let's get to the correct slide. Thank you for joining the conversation. If you appreciated the program, I invite you to like, follow, subscribe, and share the Rocktown History Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube accounts. For news and activity coming up, or at any time, I invite you to look on rocktownhistory.org, where you'll find the current events, exhibitions, and other news. For the upcoming calendar and details of past programs, click on that Learn tab. Soon we'll be listing details for next month's winter webinar conversation with a curator. And please help us keep these programs free by making a donation tonight or by becoming a member. Of course, you might see that bright orange donate button that's probably on every page. And at the bottom of the website, you can also sign up for our e-blast of occasional inbox reminders and additional history news. And again, another join button. So we love our generous and loyal membership and invite you to join them. And lastly, thank you for joining the conversation. Stay curious and support your local history. Good night.